The sound that filled the small white room wasn't a bark, but a terrified scream that sounded like metal tearing apart, making Officer Damian Hansen freeze against the wall while his heart hammered against his ribs. His partner, a massive German shepherd named Rocky, was thrashing on the stainless steel table, snapping his jaws at the doctor's hand because the pain from the bullet wound in his shoulder had driven him completely mad. Damian watched through his tears as the dog he loved more than anything tried to kill the very people who were trying to save his life. And for the first time in years, Damian felt completely helpless. Grab your coffee and stay with me, because this wasn't just a surgery. It was a secret waiting to explode. Comment "I'm watching" below, because the truth behind that scar will leave you speechless. It felt like the whole world had shrunk down to this one tiny room that smelled like rubbing alcohol and old copper pennies. Damian pressed his back hard against the cold tiles because his legs felt too weak to hold him up, and even though he wanted to rush forward to hold his dog, he knew that getting close right now would only make things worse. Dr. Simon was shouting something about the heart rate being too high, and Dr. Juliet was trying to find a vein for the sedative. But Rocky wouldn't stop moving. The dog was 100 pounds of muscle and fear, and every time the vet reached out, Rocky would lunge with his teeth bared, convinced that he was fighting for his life against enemies instead of letting his friends help him. It broke Damian's heart to see the wild look in Rocky's eyes, because usually those eyes were warm and intelligent. But right now, they were rolled back and full of panic. Hi, my amazing friends and family. Welcome back to Vigilant Heart Tales. Before we jump deep into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing all your names and countries. And don't forget to check out the other stories on the channel. Tomorrow I've got another crazy one coming that I know you'll enjoy. Alright, let's get into it. Just an hour ago, they had been sitting in the patrol car sharing a sandwich. But then the call came in, and everything went wrong so fast that Damian couldn't even process it. Rocky had taken a bullet that was meant for Damian's chest, and he had done it without hesitating for a single second. Now, watching the blood soak into the bandages on the dog's shoulder, Damian felt a heavy guilt crushing his chest because it should have been him on that table. Dr. Juliet looked up at Damian with tears in her own eyes, and her hands were shaking as she pulled the needle back. She told him that they were running out of time because Rocky's heart was beating so fast that it might explode from the stress if they didn't calm him down immediately. However, they couldn't calm him down without the medicine, and they couldn't give him the medicine if he kept trying to bite them. It was a terrible cycle, and everyone in the room knew where it was leading. Dr. Simon slammed his hand on the counter in frustration and said that if they forced the dog down, the adrenaline would kill him, but if they did nothing, he would bleed out. The room went quiet, and even though nobody said the word, Damian heard it loud and clear in his head. They were thinking about putting Rocky to sleep. They wanted to end his suffering because they couldn't save him. Damian felt like he couldn't breathe, and he buried his face in his hands to hide the sobs that were ripping through his throat. He had already lost his wife, Elena, 3 years ago in a car accident, and that loss had nearly destroyed him. The only things that had kept him going were his job, his daughter Melissa, and this dog. Losing Rocky now would be like losing the last piece of safety he had left in the world. While Damian was drowning in his grief, he didn't hear the door behind him open softly. He was so lost in the nightmare of losing his best friend that he didn't notice the small squeak of sneakers on the floor until Dr. Simon yelled out in panic. The doctor shouted for whoever it was to get out because it wasn't safe, and that shout made Damian spin around. His heart stopped when he saw his 7-year-old daughter, Melissa, standing in the doorway, clutching her dirty stuffed rabbit. She was wearing her pink pajamas, and she looked so small and fragile against the harsh lights of the surgery room. Mrs. Gable, their neighbor who had been watching her, must have brought her here when she heard the news. But Melissa had slipped away and found the room on her own. Damian screamed for her to run because he knew how dangerous Rocky was right now. The dog heard the new noise and let out a roar that shook the walls, spinning around on the table to face the door. Rocky didn't see a little girl. He only saw another threat in his delirium. He snapped his teeth at the air, lunging toward Melissa with a ferocity that made Dr. Juliet scream and grab a metal tray to use as a shield. But Melissa didn't run, and she didn't scream. She just stood there, completely still, looking at the monster on the table with her big, brown eyes. This moment was terrifying because Melissa hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years. Since the night her mother died, she had locked herself in a prison of silence. She never cried, she never laughed, and she never spoke to anyone, not even her father. The doctors said it was trauma, and Damien had spent every night praying for her to come back to him. But she remained a ghost in her own house. Yet here she was, walking toward a dangerous, bleeding animal without a hint of fear. Damien tried to move to grab her, but he was afraid that any sudden movement would make Rocky jump off the table and attack. So he stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, begging her in a whisper to stop. Melissa took another step, and then another. The vets were paralyzed with fear, watching as the little girl walked right up to the edge of the metal table where the beast was snarling. Rocky was growling low in his throat, a sound like a chainsaw, and his ears were pinned back flat against his head. But as Melissa got closer, something incredible happened. She didn't look at the blood, and she didn't look at the doctors. She looked straight into Rocky's wild eyes. She reached out her small, pale hand, and instead of pulling away, she moved it slowly toward the dog's face. Damien held his breath, expecting the worst, but then the growling stopped. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. Rocky froze, and his ears twitched forward. He stretched his neck out, sniffing the air desperately, trying to place the scent. Melissa didn't touch his head or his paw. She reached for his left ear, the one with the jagged scar he had gotten long before Damien adopted him. She placed her warm hand gently over that old scar, and the massive dog let out a sound that broke everyone's heart. It was a high, desperate whimper, like a puppy crying for its mother. Rocky's legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the table, not in death, but in total submission. He buried his nose in the little girl's neck and closed his eyes. Then, the miracle that Damien had waited 3 years for finally happened. Melissa dropped her rabbit, wrapped her arms around the dog's bloody neck, and opened her mouth. Her voice was rusty and weak, like a dry leaf being crushed, but it was clear enough for everyone to hear. She whispered that she had found him, and she told him that he had promised not to leave her in the dark. Damien fell to his knees as his daughter looked the dog in the eye and called him by a name that nobody knew, a name that changed everything. "Hello, Shadow," she whispered. The word hung in the air like a heavy fog because nobody in the room understood what it meant except for Damien, who felt the blood drain from his face as he stared at his daughter. Dr. Juliet looked from the little girl to the officer and asked quietly why she was calling the dog Shadow since his name was Rocky. But Damien couldn't answer immediately because his mind was spinning back in time to the worst night of his life 3 years ago. Although it felt like a lifetime had passed, Damien remembered every detail of the accident that took his wife, Elena, when their car skidded off the road during a freezing rainstorm and tumbled into a deep ravine where nobody could see them. The rescue teams had spent 2 days searching the woods, while Damien screamed his wife's name until his voice was gone. And when they finally found the wreck, Elena was gone. But Melissa was miraculously alive, even though she was only 4 years old and had been exposed to the freezing cold for 48 hours. The paramedics had told Damien something strange that night, saying that when they arrived at the scene, they saw a large stray dog running away from the wreckage, and they believed the animal had curled around the little girl to share its body heat, because that was the only reason she hadn't frozen to death. When Melissa woke up in the hospital before she stopped speaking, she had whispered to the nurse that Shadow had kept her warm, but Damien had assumed it was just a hallucination or an imaginary friend born from trauma. However, as he looked at the jagged scar on Rocky's ear and saw the way the dog was looking at his daughter with pure adoration, the truth hit him harder than a punch to the gut, because he realized that Rocky wasn't just a random dog he had adopted from the shelter 6 months ago. Rocky was the guardian angel who had saved his daughter in the woods, and fate had brought them back together because their bond was too strong to be broken by time or distance. Damien walked slowly toward the table with tears streaming down his face, and he whispered that it was really him, realizing that he had unknowingly adopted the very hero who had saved his child's life. Rocky wasn't fighting anymore because he had found his person, and the madness that had been in his eyes just moments ago was replaced by a deep, weary calm, as he rested his heavy head on Melissa's shoulder. Dr. Simon checked the heart monitor and announced with disbelief that the dog's heart rate was dropping to a safe level, which meant the adrenaline was fading and they could finally help him. Although the danger of the dog attacking was gone, a new danger was rising because Rocky had lost a lot of blood and the bullet was still inside him. So Dr. Juliet said they had to operate immediately or they would lose him. She moved to inject the sedative. But Melissa shook her head and said firmly that she wasn't leaving because he had stayed with her in the dark and now she had to stay with him. The doctors tried to argue that it was against protocol to have a child in surgery. But Damien stepped in and told them to forget the rules because that dog was the only reason his daughter was speaking again. So they pulled up a stool for Melissa, and she sat right next to the metal table, holding Rocky's large paw in her small hands while the anesthesia took effect, and the dog's eyes slowly closed. The surgery began, and the room became very quiet except for the rhythmic sound of the breathing machine and the soft clinking of instruments as Dr. Juliet worked to save the animal that meant so much to them. Damien stood by the door watching his daughter, who sat as still as a statue, never flinching at the sight of the blood or the scalpels because her focus was entirely on the dog. For the first time in 3 years, Damien felt a sense of hope rising in his chest because the wall of silence that Melissa had built around herself had finally cracked. And it wasn't a therapist or a doctor who had done it, but a dog who loved her unconditionally. However, just as Dr. Juliet removed the flattened bullet from Rocky's shoulder, the steady sound of the heart monitor changed to a fast, erratic rhythm that made everyone freeze. Dr. Simon shouted that the blood pressure was dropping rapidly and that Rocky was crashing because his body had been through too much trauma. Damien felt his heart stop as the doctors scrambled to push emergency drugs into the foreline. But the dog was fading fast, and the machine let out a long, continuous tone that signaled his heart had stopped beating. Panic filled the room as Dr. Simon started pressing on Rocky's chest to manually pump his heart, and Damien screamed for his partner not to quit on him. But it seemed like the fight was over. Yet, in the middle of the chaos, Melissa didn't cry or scream. Instead, she stood up and leaned over the table until her mouth was right next to the dog's ear. She started to hum a soft, shaky melody that Damien recognized instantly as the lullaby her mother used to sing to her every night before she died. It was a simple song about sunshine, and as Melissa hummed, she poured all her love and pain into that sound, begging her friend to come back to her. The doctors were working frantically, but Damien's eyes were glued to the monitor, praying for a miracle as his daughter's voice grew louder and stronger in the quiet room. Suddenly, the long, flat tone on the machine broke, and a single beat appeared on the screen, followed by another and another, until a steady rhythm returned. Dr. Juliet let out a breath she had been holding and whispered that he was coming back, looking at Melissa with awe, because she knew that medicine alone hadn't saved the dog. Rocky had heard the voice of the girl he loved, and he had fought his way back from the edge of death just to be with her again. Hours later, the sun began to rise, casting a warm orange glow into the recovery room where the danger of the night had finally passed. Damien stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee, watching the scene in the large recovery cage where Rocky was sleeping peacefully with heavy bandages wrapped around his shoulder. But the dog wasn't alone because Melissa had refused to leave his side, and she was curled up on a sleeping bag inside the cage, her head resting on Rocky's flank while his head rested on her legs. They were sleeping in the same rhythm, a tangled mess of limbs and fur that looked more like a single soul than 2 separate beings. Dr. Juliet walked up to Damien and whispered that in her 20 years of being a vet, she had never seen anything like what happened in that surgery room, admitting that while she had repaired the wound, it was Melissa who had restarted his heart. Damien nodded as he wiped a tear from his cheek, realizing that he hadn't just saved a dog that morning. He had saved his family. He walked over to the cage and knelt down on the concrete floor, and Rocky opened one eye to look at him with a deep, soulful gaze that seemed to say he would always protect her. Melissa stirred and opened her eyes, smiling at her father for the first time in years, and asked in a whisper if Shadow was going to be okay. Damien smiled back, his chest swelling with love, and told her that yes, he was going to be okay because they were a pack now, and packs stick together. As they gathered their things to eventually go home, Damien knew that the silence in their house would be gone forever. replaced by the sound of a girl talking to her dog. And that was the most beautiful sound he could ever imagine. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.